Hello and welcome to the Yukon EMS lecture on the brain for the EMR level hosted by Leslie James, head instructor for the EMR program. The brain is arguably the most complicated and complex structure in the body, and it is simultaneously the most mysterious. Despite all of our advances in modern medicine, we still do not fully understand everything about the brain. There's some things we're certain about, some things we're pretty sure about, some things are educated guesses, and some things, quite honestly, we really don't understand how it works. The brain is unique, incredible, and mysterious. We do know that it occupies about 80% of the space in the cranial vault, and it contains billions, and I do mean billions of cells. The remaining 20% of the space is comprised of blood vessels and cerebral spinal fluid. The adult brain is about 3 pounds, and just for the heck of it, the sperm whale has the largest known brain and it weighs 18 pounds, although that's not relevant for the EMR program. The brain controls involuntary and voluntary actions throughout the body. It regulates functions of respiration, heart rate, organs, and it's what looks after all of our higher functions such as speech, language, emotion. It is in many ways what makes us who we are, and any damage to it, insults to the brain, strokes, traumatic injuries, can cause life-altering, permanent changes in both function and personality. So we're going to cover some of the structures of it here. And the first exterior structure of the brain that we're going to discuss is the cerebrum. The cerebrum is truly incredible and amazing. It is responsible for all of our higher functions, such as reasoning. It is where we control speech, conscious thought. It is truly, truly incredible. It is divided into two different hemispheres. So here we're looking at the right hemisphere, and here we have the left hemisphere. The division is this fissure, or this almost like a canyon in between the two hemispheres. And it is, of course, called the interhemispheric fissure. Now, I believe the textbook refers to it as something more complicated, and I think it even says, and I quote, "It is commonly called the medial longitudinal fissure." No, it's not. I've never heard it called that. It is the interhemispheric fissure. So here we have the cerebellum. It is located beneath the cerebral hemispheres in the inferior posterior portion of the brain. It is sometimes called the athlete's brain because it is responsible for the maintenance of posture, equilibrium, and the coordination of skilled movements. In other words, if it's a voluntary function, if it's something you can think and have happen, chances are it is interpreted and controlled here in the cerebellum. So the next structure we're going to take a look at here is the medulla oblongata. This is the lowest portion of the brain. This is the portion of the brain that exits the cranial vault and continues down to the spinal column, where we then call it the spinal cord. The medulla oblongata is what regulates involuntary functions, just like the heart rate, respirations, blood pressure, digestion, and certain other functions it helps control, such as sneezing and swallowing, which are semi-voluntary actions. The medulla oblongata and the other elements in the brainstem also control the fight or flight response. This is what we sometimes refer to as the reptilian brain, and damage here can lead to cardiac arrest, death, and when we get into the respiratory section of the course, you will learn that certain respiratory patterns, such as Stokes, Biot's, and others, are indicative of damage to this portion of the brain and is not something as a practitioner you should ignore. These are life-threatening emergencies. So here we have the midbrain, and this is the part of the brainstem that has multiple functions such as controlling vision, hearing, being able to sleep, being able to wake up, temperature control, and this is where the ocular motor, or the cranial nerve number 3, is housed. The next thing we want to look at here is the pons. This is a key regulator of the respiratory system. It controls the speed or the rate of respiration, and it is essential to life. If there's something wrong with the pons, that means there's something wrong with respiration and ventilation. And we all know that if there's something wrong with respiration and ventilation, then there's not a good likelihood of an outcome that is positive for our patient. The next structure I'm going to point out very quickly is the Rolandic fissure. So why do we need to know about this? Well, a couple of reasons. This is also known, by the way, as the central sulcus. It is a very deep groove, as you can see, and it runs down the side of the brain. It is used as a landmark to separate the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe, and it acts as a boundary between the primary somatic sensory cortex and the primary motor cortex areas of the brain responsible for sensing touch and executing movement, respectively. Now, like other grooves on the brain, it also increases surface area. So you'll notice how the brain is literally wrinkly. It's like you've left something in water for far too long, such as your hand. It gets all pruny and wrinkly. Well, the purpose of these wrinkles or fissures, if you want to be medically correct, is to maximize the surface area of the brain. More surface area, more nerve cells, more ability. It allows you to pack in more things into a smaller space. Now, looking at the side of the brain, we're going to change things up a little bit here. And instead of just looking at it externally, let's slice off half the brain. Ta-da! Now we're going to look at some additional structures. The first one I want to draw your attention to is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a small structure, and it is located just above the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is an important link between the nervous system and the endocrine system, and allows it to play a very important role in homeostasis, or balance of the body. Although the pituitary gland is often called the master gland of the body, the hypothalamus helps to regulate pituitary function. And the hypothalamus is what produces releasing hormones. And releasing hormones are what control other hormones that respond to internal and external factors, such as stress or circulating levels of other hormones. So now we're going to put back part of the brain and then slice off the top. And the first thing I want you to look at here is gray matter. What is gray matter? We always hear people talk about it. Gray matter makes up about 40% of the brain, and it consists of neuronal cell bodies, and it houses neurons' nucleuses. In addition to the nucleus, gray matter also contains glial cells. The remaining 60% of the brain matter consists of white matter bundles of neural fibers connecting to the gray matter. And since we just mentioned white matter, I might as well show you what it looks like. So let's put the brain back into one piece. And now let's take a look at what white matter is. This is a visualization of white matter in the brain. White matter usually lies inside of gray matter. Conversely, in the spine, white matter is outside of gray matter. White matter contains a high amount of fat, which makes up the myelin sheath that surrounds nerve axons. Also, white matter connects different areas of gray matter together. White matter, which makes up about 60% of the brain, is primarily composed of nerve axons, while gray matter is primarily neuronal cell bodies. And while we're here, let's just take a little slice so you can get a better interpretation. We'll take a half visualization of the brain here, and let's slice off the top and look at it from above. So now you can kind of get a better idea of the structure of white matter in the brain. Now we're back to our slice off the top look, and let's take a look at some of the other structures here. So over here, we have our thalamus. The thalamus consists of two oval-shaped structures that sit at the base of the cerebrum. The function is primarily sensory, transferring information from the spinal cord to the brainstem, and eventually to the cerebral cortex. The sensory information is interpreted while primarily sensory, the thalamus does have some motor control. It is also part of the limbic system, which is involved with emotion and memory. Now, let's put the brain back into one piece, and let's make the outside invisible, and just look at the inside. So the first thing we're going to look at, after we, of course, appreciate just how interesting this structure is inside, is we're going to take a look at the amygdala. So what is the amygdala? This is part of the limbic system with primary functions of remembering our emotions, and unfortunately, it remembers primarily fear. It allows us to remember how we felt in various situations and to be more prepared and aware of similar situations in the future. In experiments where the amygdala is removed from rats, the rats have shown little, if any, fear in dangerous situations. And let's just zoom in a little bit here and get a nice look. And you can tell that it's on both sides of the brain. The next structure we're going to look at here is the caudate nucleus. Now, each hemisphere of the brain contains a caudate nucleus, and we can see that the structure is visually apparent on both sides. It's a C-shaped structure, as you can see, has an important role in memory storage. It acts kind of like a SATA controller on a computer's motherboard. It also uses past experiences and memories to influence future actions. Degeneration of the caudate nucleus is associated with Huntington's disease. The next structure I'm going to discuss here is going to be the corpus callosum. So at the base of the intercerebral fissure, we have the corpus callosum. This is the bridge that connects the two sides of the brain together. Think of it as a suspension bridge. It's a pathway between the two hemispheres. Now, officially, if this region is damaged, there's limited ability to coordinate functions between the left and the right sides of the body. Interestingly enough, if you are young enough when you suffer a severe insult to the brain, or if, let's say, you're 3 years old and you've had a radical hemispherectomy and half of the brain is literally physically removed through surgery, the brain is still able to rewire itself, which is, I find, to be an incredibly fascinating thing. The next structure we're going to look at is the fimbra. There's a left and a right side. They're white matter tracts originating in the hippocampus of the limbic system, deep inside the brain. Think of them as kind of like thick, fringy fibers, and you can see them in there a little bit better. And they travel alongside the hippocampus, and they merge together to form the fornix. These white matter tracts, such as fimbriae, act similar to bundles of insulated electrical wires, and they allow messages to pass from one part of the brain to another very rapidly. Fimbriae kind of form an ability to recall old memories as well. Think of them as the SATA cable between a storage device and your computer's CPU to rapidly recall memories. Now, speaking of the fornix, let's slice away half the brain again so we can get a better visualization. Close off fimbriae, and let's take a look at the fornix here. So what is this? What is this structure? In Latin, it means arch. Formex is part of the limbic system and it works closely with other structures, including the hippocampus, to formulate memories. When it's damaged, antegrade amnesia may result. These individuals are unable to formulate new memories. Speaking of hippocampus, let's put the brain back intact and let's spin around. It's believed that the hippocampus has primary responsibility for formation of new memories. Studies have shown that an individual who must commit a large amount of spatial information to memory, like a taxi cab driver, has a larger hippocampus than his non-driver peers, which is very interesting. Makes me wonder if those of us who are in EMS and have to memorize the layout of our local areas and be intimately familiar with all the ways to get to locations may also have a similarly sized increased hippocampus. Now, let's slice off half the brain again and spin back over here, and let's talk about the interthalamic adhesion. So what is this? The interthalamic adhesion is a bridge of tissue that connects the thalamus on the right and the left hemispheres. The function of it exactly is, well, to be kind of honest, we're not really sure. It is completely absent in some people, and it's there in others. Despite the physical connection, there are no interthalamic fibers that exchange information across the bridge. So we're really not 100% sure what it does. But it's there, and if you see it in the textbook, now you know what it is. So welcome to the lentiform nucleus. This is one of several groups of clustered neuron structures that form the basal ganglia of the brain, which itself is a region embedded within the cerebral hemispheres. The lentiform nucleus consists of two distinct nuclei, the putamen and the globuus pallidus. Chronic diseases involving these structures have been found to cause Parkinson's and other movement disorders. And you can see that it's on both sides of the brain. Now, the next structure we're going to talk about here is the mammillary body. This is located at the ends of the anterior arches of the formex. The mammillary bodies are primarily responsible for memory recall. The pituitary gland, a roughly pea-sized structure located, if you were to draw a line from your ears and another line from your nose towards the back of your head where those two lines would intersect, would be a roughly location of the pituitary gland. It is housed in a structure called the sella tunica. This is a bony structure that helps protect the pituitary gland. However, in cases of cancer or any structural insult, it does not exactly allow for a lot of swelling. The pituitary gland is often called the master gland, as it helps regulate growth hormone, production of prolactin in the breasts, production of estrogen and progesterone in the ovaries, production of testosterone in the testes, production of cortical hormones in the adrenal cortex, production of thyroid hormones in the thyroid gland, and production of oxytocin and vasopressin in the kidneys, as well as the production of hypothalamic hormones as well. The pituitary is in two lobes, and you can see here the sulcus that divides them, and you have the anterior and the posterior. The front or anterior lobe is roughly 80% of the pituitary gland's weight. The back posterior lobe contains the remaining amount. The lobes are connected to the hypothalamus by a stalk that contains blood vessels and nerve projections. The hypothalamus controls the anterior lobe by releasing hormones through the connecting blood vessels, and it controls the posterior lobe through nerve impulses. The hormones produced by the pituitary gland are not produced continuously. It releases them in bursts in roughly 1 to every 3 hours. The rise and fall of the production of hormones also matches that of our circadian rhythms, which is why us poor shift workers often have such issues dealing with changes to our shift patterns. The anterior lobe produces the following hormones: adrenocorticotropic hormone, Follicle stimulating hormone, which of course helps the female release and produce eggs, releases growth hormone, which helps stimulate and regulate growth and physical development, and prolactin, which stimulates the mammary glands of the breast to produce milk, and thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones. The anterior lobe also produces several other hormones, including ones that cause the skin to darken, like beta melanocyte stimulating hormones, and others that inhibit pain sensations, such as endorphins and enkephalins, which help control the immune system response. The posterior lobe of the pituitary gland produces two incredibly important hormones as well: vasopressin and oxytocin. Vasopressin is often known as a antidiuretic hormone, and it regulates the amount of water excreted by the kidneys. And it is crucial in helping to maintain the water balance of the body. In some cases, you may find issues where the patient may have an overproduction of pituitary hormones. This can lead to acromegaly or gigantism, where growth hormone is overproduced, Cushing's disease, where adrenocorticotropic hormone is excessively produced, galactorrhea, which is the creation of breast milk by men or women who are not pregnant, which is from an overproduction of prolactin. You can have erectile dysfunction, which is again from prolactin, and infertility, which again is often related to excessive production of prolactin. You can also have underproduction of pituitary hormones, which can cause disorders such as central diabetes insipidus, which is caused by vasopressin, and hypopituitarism, which is a multi-hormonal issue. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the importance of the pituitary gland. Very small, yet very important. While we're here, let's also discuss the vermis. The vermis runs along the mid-sagittal plane of the cerebellum and separates the cerebellum into right and left hemispheres. So to get a better idea of that, let's slice the brain in half again, spin the camera over, and now we can get a good look of the vermis. While the cerebellum helps coordinate movement, vermis specifically is thought to play an important role in maintaining an upright posture. The word vermis comes from the Latin word for worm. Interesting. Next, we're going to talk about here, while the brain is still sliced open for us, is the septum pellucidum. The septum pellucidum is a very thin double membrane that forms a wall between the left and the right ventricles of the brain. It is located between the anterior horns and runs vertically, connecting to the corpus callosum superiorly to the fornix inferiorly. In rare cases, infants are born without this membrane, which results in multiple abnormalities, ranging from issues with intellect to seizures. When an isolated malformation is identified, it is usually not considered to be life-threatening. However, a complete failure for it to be in existence is considered to be life-threatening due to the debilitating seizures. While we're here, let's just take a quick tour of the inner portions of the brain with the labels attached so you can get a good visual representation of where they all are. So the next structure we're going to talk about here is the choroid plexus. So the cells of the choroid plexus have an incredibly important job, and that is to produce cerebral spinal fluid. CSF is a clear fluid that circulates in the brain and spinal cord, acting as a cushion for these vital structures. CSF is roughly 99% water. If you see it outside of the brain, we have a problem. One of the ways that we as practitioners can identify the presence of cerebral spinal fluid is if you have fluid that seems to be clear or straw-colored coming from the nares or the ears. You can take a 4x4, or 2x2, place the gauze over that, pull it away. If it forms a halo-like ring, that's CSF. That's bad. Let's take a look at the ventricular system here for the brain with half of the brain removed, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. You can visualize the tissue that produces CSF a little bit better now. And let's just once again view it from the top. So this should give you a good idea in 3D where all the structures are for the brain. Next, we're going to talk about circulation. So here we have the circulatory tree for the brain. Incredibly complex, eerily beautiful, and terrifying if something has gone wrong. So let's get into it. The first structure we're going to talk about here is the basilar artery. Now, at the base of the skull, there's two vertebral arteries that join together to form the basilar artery. The basilar artery has multiple branches that together bring oxygenated blood to the cerebellum, brainstem, and the occipital lobes of the brain before it splits to two posterior cerebral arteries. Because of the vascular distribution of this vascular distribution, a basilar artery stroke will result in multiple simultaneous symptoms such as vertigo, lack of coordination, and double vision. The next one we're going to discuss is the internal carotid artery located here. The internal carotid arteries run vertically on both sides of the neck and supply oxygenated blood to the head at the level of the third and fourth vertebrae, in other words C3 and C4. The carotid arteries bifurcate into the internal and external carotid arteries. The internal carotid arteries bring blood to the brain, while the external carotid arteries bring blood to the face and the neck. When you check your pulse in your neck, you're feeling the carotid artery. Down over here, we have the internal jugular vein. The internal jugular vein drains blood from the brain, face, and the neck. It's located within the carotid sheath alongside both the vagus nerve and the carotid artery. Deoxygenated blood is delivered to the right atrium of the heart after combining with the subclavian vein. Given its superficial location in the neck, the internal jugular vein is susceptible to injury and can cause life-threatening hemorrhage. The next one we're going to look at over here is the middle cerebral artery. The middle cerebral artery is a branch of the internal carotid artery and is the most common cerebral blood vessel to be affected by strokes, also known as CVAs or cerebral vascular accidents, or if they're transient in nature and they self-resolve in under half an hour, then they are TIAs or transient ischemic attacks. Next, we're going to look at the occipital sinus. The occipital sinus is one of the dural venous sinuses, and unlike most parts of the brain, it is typically only one structure, rather than one on each side of the brain. Together, the cranial sinuses drain venous blood from the brain. Over here is the sigmoid sinus. The sigmoid sinus is part of the dural venous sinuses. These sinuses lie between the endosteal and meningeal layers of the dura mater and drain deoxygenated venous blood. Blood is carried via the sinuses from the brain, face, and scalp to the internal jugular vein. You can see how the structures are contiguous because here, of course, is your internal jugular vein. Next step, we're going to have the straight sinus. So I'm just going to slice the brain in half here, spin her around, and here we have the straight sinus. This is part of the dural venous sinuses. They lie between the endosteal and meningeal layers of the brain and drain deoxygenated venous blood. Now, let's put the brain back into one place and spin our way up here and take a look at the superior sagittal sinus. The superior sagittal sinus is a single sinus that runs along the falx cerebrae, in other words, the top of the brain over top of the fissure, and it's a small indentation that lies between the two cerebral hemispheres. The sinus drains venous blood from the cerebral hemisphere back to the confluence of sinuses and ultimately to the internal jugular veins, which are located down here at the bottom. Next up, we're going to have the transverse sinus over here. Transverse sinus lies on the interior surface of the occipital bone. The transverse sinuses, again, allow for venous blood flow to drain. So there you have it, the circulatory system for the human brain. And I'll just throw this on here. This is cerebral spinal fluid, and it's just visualizing the bath of fluid that the brain sits in, so you can get an idea. I hope this tour of the human brain has been of some benefit to you.